This is the Dallas Morning News.
I'm Talmadge Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross Examining History, where we explore America's fascinating past with our country's leading historians and thought leaders. For this podcast, I interviewed Pulitzer winning historian Jon Meacham about the new anthology he's put together titled American Struggle, Democracy, Dissent, and the Pursuit of a More Perfect Union. It came out on February 17, 2026, and we did the program virtually on March 17, 2026. Enjoy. Jon Meacham, welcome to the podcast series Cross Examining History. We're here to talk about your wonderful new anthology collection, American Struggle, Democracy, Dissent, and the Pursuit of a More Perfect Union. What inspired you to assemble this wonderful anthology that I believe should be in every high school history classroom in America?
Well, thank you, Talmadge, and I hope I don't have to take an oath for the cross-examination. I wanted to, this is something you don't often hear biographers or historians or lawyers say. I wanted to get out of the way. I wanted the voices of the American past, which are incredibly resonant and relevant in our own time, to speak for themselves. I wanted to summon them to the stand, I guess, to stay within the metaphor. And it to some extent grew out of the book I did about 8 years ago called The Soul of America. These
You
were
and I did programs on together when you came to Dallas.
exactly. And I wanted to hear from the people who, like all of us, were in a moment, were in hours that were contingent and conditional and uncertain and fraught and consequential, and do what I think history at its best can do, which is put yourself back in a moment that the outcome of which is uncertain, and you don't know how it's going to turn out. As our mutual friend David McCullough used to say, nobody walked around in the past and said, "Oh, what an interesting world the past is."
Well, let's start with the overview that's contained in the book's introduction. You say that America's struggle is not the work of a day, but is the animating force of our history. Because human beings, unfortunately, take action because of greed, cruelty, and injustice. So, Jon, as far as American history goes, to use Lincoln's words, is it true that right makes might, but it takes a while because we have to overcome our many human failings?
It is absolutely the case. And the significance of Cooper Union, the speech you quote, is that Lincoln was making a moral case in a world more given to bending itself to brute force than to appeals to conscience. And it's an interesting, as ever with Lincoln, it's a fascinating rhetorical cocktail he mixed there, because he acknowledges, the formulation acknowledges that brute force, what Hamilton called force and accident, is that brute force is the default position. What Lincoln was calling us to do there is to flip it round. And to flip it round requires an effort of heart and mind, because it's easier to amass strength and exert your will. Not easier, but it's more common. And what the American experiment is, and part of its difficulty, part of its contingency, is that we are undertaking an experiment in which brute force should not be the predominant factor in our public life. That was what the founders were doing. Again, Hamilton said it in the First Federalist, that the Constitution was an attempt to let reason and deliberation prevail over force and accident. And I think what Lincoln was doing, as he did at Gettysburg with the Declaration, was reframed those arguments for that generation in a brilliant and memorable way.
Well, right makes might only if we truly have a conscientious citizenship that has the moral perspective to know right from wrong. So my question is, do we still have that trait in America's citizens in 2026?
Yes, of course we do. The question is whether it will be predominant.
I'll accept that as a friendly amendment.
Will be, yes. I mean, you have a conscience. I have a conscience. Everybody I know has a conscience. They may not listen to it. They may not heed it. I certainly don't heed mine all the time. But that part of human nature doesn't change. The perennial struggle is between our basest instincts and what you've characterized as the conscience, what Lincoln would have said were the better angels of our nature. But an important thing, let me add this, an important thing, and the thing that gives me the most hope for our own time, is that the Republic thrives and survives on the proportional role of empathy, right? Of our, which is another way of framing what you asked. Empathy in the American context, and this is what, as I say, this is what gives me the most hope. Empathy does not have to be a selfless undertaking. Empathy actually can be quite pragmatic and serving of both others and oneself. Because if I lend you a hand, you are more likely to lend me one. And I think that is another way of framing it is democracy has to deliver, right? If the Republic cannot help create the conditions for lives of prosperity and purpose, then the cares and concerns of those who feel left out and feel that the Republic is not delivering will tend and trend away from it. And I think that in many ways is what we've seen in the elections of 2016 and 2024.
Yep. Now, you say that democracies change to meet challenges only when the public sentiment gets persuaded to change. And your book has several passages from the greatest persuaders in American history. But in 2026, is there anyone in today's political arena that you believe has the power to persuade the American middle?
It is the central question of our time. And I would take one step, half a step back and say this. I think the American middle should speak for itself. And I think the American middle enjoys too much a feeling of alienation from our politics. I think that there's a kind of, just to be very blunt, there's a kind of self-indulgence of the disappointed moderate. Get over it. Let's get over it, right? This is, no one is going, there's not going to be anyone on horseback. You've written about leadership. You know very well that the alchemy of leadership is not simply about the singular person, but it's this fascinating unfolding commerce between the leaders and the led. The led enable the leaders to do things. The leaders point the led to different things. It's a very complicated dynamic. But what is required is standing in the arena and saying that a polarized republic cannot long endure. And if we, and I think I think I can say that in this conversation, but if the American middle, which is to say, to define our terms, those who believe that perhaps, as the great Tennessean Howard Baker wonderfully said, those who believe that the other fella might just be right every once in a while, if those folks are not willing to stand and say that a politics in which total war is expected and unfolding, but in fact, our politics must be an arena of contention in which we go into battle, and it is often battle. We accept the rules of the Constitution, the rules of the game. We come to a certain, excuse me, excuse me. We enter into an arena of contention. We have interests that contend against each other. We agree on certain rules. We come to a certain resolution for a given period of time, and then we do it all again. Right? That's what a constitution, that's what the rule of law. You're a lawyer, you know this. Without that rule, you then go into the Hobbesian state of nature, which is the war of all against all. And that's what monarchies are. It's what we broke away from, was that so that the whims and appetites of a single person would not affect the destinies of all. If the American middle is not willing to say that polarization is bad, and if they're not willing, within the practical system we have, to vote for someone with whom they probably disagree on most things, but who believes and shares that understanding of what politics should be, then we're going to deserve what we get. That's a very circuitous way of saying the following, which I should just say more pithily. I did not understand why many of my Republican friends, and I live in Tennessee, so when I say I have Republican friends, that's redundant, why they would not, in 2020 and 2024, why, given the binary choice of our national politics, because of the system we have, why they were not willing to vote for the other party, because the other party might make decisions they don't want, but would make decisions within a system that would be preserved. And there are folks who just could not, because of the partisan nature of their makeup, simply couldn't do it. You and I know lots of people like this, right?
America's people largely worship the same God and aspire to align themselves with his providence. And I'm wondering whether that's still the case anymore in 2026. I'm curious what you think about that.
It is obviously far less the case. The cultural commonality of the really even through World War II, right, was a force for unity, but it was also a force that was operative when we fought a civil war, right? Mm-hmm. So the battle over what is Providence, where is Providence taking us, is a perennial one. I believe that any attempt to sustain the American Republic will require religiously inclined people to see that the civic sphere in which religious liberty is central is vital to the maintenance of their own faith. I also believe that our finest hours as a country have been fundamentally shaped by by convictions that are absolutely coherent with religious conviction. And so one of my worries, and I'd love your reaction to this, about the current moment is I fear, and there have been a couple of people who've made this point, I fear that in some ways partisanship is the new religion. We have our own, partisans have their own prophets, have their own holy books. They only talk to fellow believers. And sociologically speaking, the means of religion, which should ideally compel us to move toward loving our neighbor as ourselves, the sociology of it is actually dividing us as opposed to bringing us closer together. And I worry about that all the time.
Yeah, we have a friend in Dallas, you probably heard this, who said, I want my kids to marry someone who's of our faith and believes in our politics. And I think whoever their mate is, it's more important that they believe in our politics than our faith.
Yeah. And that's, wow. Right? Wow.
Yeah, wow.
And that's just, and I think that's different, right? I mean, that is and when people like you and me say something's unprecedented, pay attention, because that's against our business model. But I think that's, I don't think you would have heard that, even in, say, 1992, right? Was, to use a Dallas example, like if you were a Perot, if your child was about to marry the daughter of a Perot supporter, a Bush supporter, or a Clinton supporter, that was probably not determinative, right? And so something has happened here, and
Well,
it needs to, we need to address it. And one of the reasons I wanted to put these voices together was to remind us that there is the theme that runs through American history that is prevalent in eras that we should want to emulate and commemorate, is the theme of realizing more fully the implications of the Declaration of Independence. And that's about the sanctity of the individual, a radical idea. A radical idea in Judaism, a radical idea in early Christianity, a radical idea in the late 18th century in the nascent United States of America.
Well, that brings us to part 2 of the book, which covers 1776 to 1815, the time period that covers the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, the Constitution, and through the War of 1812. And our leading founders obviously had different perspectives on how the political system in our republic should work. George Washington opposed partisan battles waged by political parties because they destroyed the feelings of unity among the people that he thought was so critical to the success of our republic. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, thought political parties were inevitable and ultimately good for the republic as long as the rule of law was maintained. John Adams believed there need to be an equilibrium of power between the partisan factions. So throughout American history, we've had a seesaw as political parties held power, and then they lose it, then they hold it again, then they lose it again, such that over time, the two parties have achieved, per Adams' goal, a measure of equilibrium. So why do you believe this equilibrium amid partisan strife has stayed in place as long as it has?
It has stayed in place and has generated a political life of give and take, of rule-based contention, not least because the parties themselves have historically played an intermediating role in American life. That is, that there have been, from decade to decade, and in fact, century to century, the parties have tended to be heterogeneous undertakings in which those parties, by ultimately producing candidates who take positions of responsibility and authority within the government, have a role in a competitive role, right? That they are themselves realms of competition. That is changing radically, and it would give Edmund Burke and Jefferson and Madison and Adams and Washington and Hamilton great pause, because the parties at this juncture are, in our own time, are not having internal debates and producing, depending on the jurisdiction, different kinds of candidates. They are instead producing the absolute same kind of person. It has moved from a kind of individualized boutique approach to a franchise one, right? So at this point, if you are a Republican nominee in the 5th District of Tennessee, you are probably going to be almost identical ideologically to somebody in the 5th District of Maine. Does Maine have 5 districts? Probably not, but you know what I mean. And so parties at their best are intermediating institutions. At this point, they have become these franchise factories. And I think that institutionalizes partisanship in a way that, and this is a very familiar point to everybody, that if the primary is the most important thing, then you don't create an incentive for there to be a kind of spirit of accommodation and compromise once they are in office.
Right. Now, speaking of Thomas Jefferson, I think you and everybody else would recognize he was what we'd call a complicated person, the author of the American Creed that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights. Yet he owned hundreds of slaves at Monticello throughout his life. He fathered children with his slave, Sally Hemings. So he had his own internal American struggle over the issue of slavery. You wrote a wonderful biography of him in 2012. His face is still on Mount Rushmore, the nickel, and the $2 bill. We still have a Jefferson Memorial in the nation's capital. So despite his decades of morally challenged dealings with his slaves, why is he still worthy of recognition as an American hero in 2026?
I believe because he articulated a vision of human freedom that, while, as you lay out so well, while he did not live into or up to the aspirations he articulated them. He also, my argument about him is that he was a much more important American president than people remember. He doubled the size of the country, for instance. And my sense is, and I follow my friend and colleague Annette Gordon Reed on this. Professor Gordon Reed, when she's asked that question, sometimes just says, "How much do you want from one person?" There's a certain, my God, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was an architect of an American politics that, for all of its failings, we continue to live with. And, implicit in all the questions that folks like you and I get in the world is, the 2 questions we get are, has it ever been like this? And how do we get out of it? Right. But implicit in that is the stipulation that there has been in the world the ethos that of which Jefferson was a critical architect, something worth preserving and promulgating. And so I believe that looking at Jefferson, whether it's on the nickel, although we stopped making the penny, right? I guess we still have nickels.
Still have nickels.
We still have nickel. Good. I'm glad we have some. I think in terms of the mechanics of memory, and I think you and I have discussed this before, the mechanics of memory, memorializing people is not necessarily about deifying them. When you look at Jefferson, I hope that you will see the complicated figure that you just described. And to me, the moral utility of history is not to look up at it adoringly, and certainly not to look down on it condescendingly as if we are so much more perfect than they are, but to look at them and see that if even the best people of a given generation could get something so wrong, what on earth are we getting wrong? And let's try to fix it in time so that people in the future don't look back and hold us to a moral account.
Well, similarly, you also wrote your Pulitzer-winning biography of Andrew Jackson, who suffered some of the same problems Jefferson did. He was a slave owner. He also was hard on Native Americans. And in this socially conscious 21st century we're living in the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll, I see that in the year 2000, he was ranked as our 13th greatest president. And in the most recent poll in 2021, he's fallen to 22nd, which means he's barely in the top half.
Yeah.
So given his historic stand to preserve the Union and bring the federal government to the people, where do you come out in the American struggle to evaluate Jackson's legacy? I assume it's very similar to what you just said about Jefferson.
It is. And Jackson, to me, the important thing about Jackson is that if one wants to banish him from public life, if you want to take him off the $20 bill or remove statues and all that, be very careful, because there's a convenience to that, I should say, a moral convenience that lets the rest of the country off the hook. He was the leader of a democracy, right? The country, broadly put, wanted what he gave them. I live on land that indigenous people controlled. I suspect you do. There was not a great abolition level moral crusade to defend the indigenous people in real time. That does not excuse what happened, but it does help, I think, explain it. And so to banish Jackson is to let the rest of us off the hook. And I just don't believe there's any utility in blaming singular people for national sins. And African American slavery and Native American removal are the two original sins of American life. Full stop. As you just said, I think Jackson, and I think when you look at him in Lafayette Square, he's there because he was president. He was a fascinating president. He was an architect of a presidency that would be at what President Kennedy would later call the vital center of action. He stood up against the nullifiers of South Carolina. He articulated a vision of the Union, as he put it, that was not a league, but a compact. He saw the Constitution as a unifying document that could not be broken at will by individual interests for their temporary expedience. And when Abraham Lincoln was writing his first inaugural, he did the closest thing he could to sending for Andrew Jackson, who had died 15 years before. He sent for the nullification proclamation of December 10th, 1832, and stood for
the perpetuity of the Union in the way Jackson had. And again, I think that that's not a bad story to have running through one's head when you look at a portrait of Old Hickory.
Yep. Well, part 4 is devoted entirely to the 4-year presidency of Abraham Lincoln and, of course, the Civil War, which you call a time of fiery trial. You wrote a wonderful biography of Lincoln that came out in 2022, recognizing the huge evolution that took place on the issue of ending America's struggle with slavery, which was the central political and moral issue of the era. And Lincoln did it in less than 4 years. Do you regard him as the greatest persuader of America's public sentiment in our history?
I think so. I think you could argue, you could put Franklin Roosevelt and maybe President Johnson and LBJ and President Reagan. That would be an interesting 4-way battle to see. One of the things you learn, one of the cautionary lessons you learn in all those examples is, but particularly Lincoln and LBJ, is they are brilliant persuaders. They bent the arc of history in a way they wanted to, but not forever. And it snapped back very quickly. You know, the story of Reconstruction is the story of an attempt of folks who look like me to repeal the verdict of the war.
Yeah,
And
your part 5 of the book covers 1865 to 1932, when the nation stayed out of major wars but had, quote, a troubled peace. So speaking of Reconstruction, was that period from 1865 to 1877, was that when America was the farthest removed from John Winthrop's shining city on a hill?
I would, it's a great question. I think you'd have to say that a country with a system of enslavement that enslaved 4 million people and then felt it necessary to fight a war that killed 750,000 people to get rid of it was pretty bad. I think for an intensive period of how partisanship, how feelings about race and power, how those things can lead us farther and farther away, as you say, from the Declaration, from the spirit of the Constitution. Yes, I think the Reconstruction and the ensuing Jim Crow era, which lasted tragically so long, is a clear example of how illiberalism can become part of the fabric of the country. And we do ourselves no favors by somehow pretending that everything was great in the past, or on the other side, that everything was unrelievedly bleak. Uh, this is a human story. We have good days and bad days. We have good eras and bad eras.
We have flawed people who
Oh
have
my
strengths
God.
and weaknesses.
Oh my God. We've been doing this since the 2nd chapter of Genesis, right? You know, there was a piece of fruit. We were told not to take it. We took it, and mayhem ensued. Uh, and that's still unfolding, right? Appetite and ambition and the Federalist Papers and the constitutional debate. It's fundamentally, it's a theological debate. You know, it's about John Witherspoon, who wrote about the depravity of man, you know, a significant Calvinist view of the world. You know, the Constitution is predicated on, quite explicitly, on the insight that no one can be trusted with too much power because human beings, given the opportunity, will abuse that power.
Well,
And
that
we
leads us
did
to
it during Reconstruction.
right. Moving on to part 6 is devoted entirely to Franklin Roosevelt's presidency from 1933 to 1945. And you wrote a the book on the epic friendship between FDR and Winston Churchill that came out in 2003. He's the only president who was elected to a third and fourth term in our history. So was his going
So far.
beyond was his going beyond George Washington's two-term limit example a good thing or a bad thing for America?
Great question. I think you have to answer it in two ways. A President Wilkie would have fought World War II. He was an interventionist. He was not an isolationist in 1940. 1944, it gets trickier. FDR, I think it was it Richard Neustadt who said that FDR's philosophy of the presidency was himself in it. And I think that, we got Harry Truman by just the narrowest of lucky breaks. What if, to go back to argue that 1940 was a mistake begins to raise the question of what if FDR had won in 40, but died anytime before January 1945. So if something had happened, we would have had President Henry Wallace. Not a great idea. Very left wing. Probably, I'm being very crude in this, but too pro-Soviet. So it's a great question because it is we don't think of what could have happened in a bad way with FDR, and we tend to credit the choice of Truman because Truman ends up supporting NATO and the Marshall Plan and becoming a formidable president. But it could have gone the other way in a literal heartbeat or lack thereof. And so, all in all, I think it reminds us that in America, there should be no indispensable men.
Well, going back to the discussion we had on both Jefferson and Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt did little or nothing to advance civil rights or help the Jews during the Holocaust, and he totally embarrassed himself with the internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. And yet he's regarded by leading historians as our third greatest president, still behind only Lincoln and Washington. So what's your explanation for why he still ranks so high by historians in the context of where America's social conscience is in the 21st century?
Like all of these judgments, they end up being relative ones, which you have to balance against the debits. The important debits you just mentioned is the salvation in many ways of democratic capitalism. In 1933, it was an open question whether the United States would remain a complicated, messy, and largely inefficient democratic nation, or whether we would go the way of Berlin and Rome and Tokyo and Moscow and move to a totalitarian, authoritarian system. And Roosevelt, who could have moved in a more dictatorial direction, chose not to. His opponents claimed he did anyway, but he did not. And he believed fundamentally in, as he put it, that the Constitution of 1787 did not create a perfect country, but that it remained the best way for us to try to realize the purposes of the country as articulated by Jefferson. So I think the creation of a federal government that was responsive to the needs of an industrial nation as opposed to a largely agrarian one, which is what the New Deal really did. And then the unleashing of the immense productive capacity of American industry to prevail in the Second World War. I think those two things tend to outweigh the very serious mistakes in judgment that he made in other spheres.
Mm-hmm. Now, after Roosevelt and during Truman's presidency, beginning in 1950 and until 1954, United States Senator Joseph McCarthy initiated and orchestrated the Red Scare and its witch hunts. So, in that era, why were so many Americans so willing to believe McCarthy's lies?
Well, let's put ourselves back there, right? We have finished a cataclysmic world war. Within minutes, really, the Soviet Union is also a nuclear power, not least because of genuine espionage, both the Rosenbergs and other examples. There was, not least because the Soviet Union was an ally during the Second World War. There were people who were had kind of, if not pro-Soviet, at least Soviet sympathetic views, who had come to Washington, who had worked in the government, worked in the military during the Second World War. And then the world changed. And the Korean War, the acquisition by the Soviet Union of atomic weapons of mass destruction, and the fact that there were Soviet assets in the federal government. The irony of McCarthy, so that's why they believed it. The irony of McCarthy, and this drove Harry Truman crazy until the day he died, is that Truman alienated his own left wing with a very stringent loyalty program undertaken in his administration. It was part of what led to the irritation and disaffection with Truman in the 1948 campaign. He was stuck between the Dixiecrats on one side, Strom Thurmond and others, who thought he was too liberal, and the more liberal civil libertarian wing of the party that thought he was too conservative. So what did he deal with in 1948? He dealt with Henry Wallace breaking away with the Progressive Party and Strom Thurmond breaking away with the Dixiecrats and barely won, defeated Tom Dewey, continuing 20 years, therefore, making 20 years of Democratic rule. McCarthy came late to this story. And one relevant detail for our time is that the best source on McCarthy is a guy who was also a lawyer for a young real estate developer in New York named Donald Trump, Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was counsel to McCarthy, and he wrote a very important book on McCarthy in 1968, quite honest, in which he said that McCarthy was looking for a means to national prominence. He thought about, you'll love this, the St. Lawrence Seaway, but that didn't seem to have much sex appeal. And so, as Roy Cohn said, Joe McCarthy bought anti-communism the way other people might buy a car. It was just as cold as that. And
looking for an issue.
looking for an issue, and he found it. And thank God, Margaret Chase Smith, who was kind of the Liz Cheney of the era, stood up early on and said, this is not who we should be. And she only had 6 supporters in 1950 who were against McCarthy. McCarthy called her Snow White and the Six Dwarfs. But in 1954, everybody was with her. So she was early.
Yeah. Now, Dwight Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander, the architect of D-Day, and 8 years after the war, he became president. He's regarded as one of our greatest presidents. You're now writing a biography of him that hopefully will be coming out in the fall of next year. So what trait about Ike stands out the most to you during the American struggle of his era?
He was a politician, but not a partisan. He believed in the capacity, the efficacy, the necessity of the public sphere in American life to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was entirely a product of engines of social mobility available to white folks of his era. Right? The only private paychecks he ever got were from Columbia University for a couple of years when he was president in the 1940s. He went to public schools. He went to West Point. He served in the military. He was supreme commander of NATO, comes back and runs for president. Why did he run for president? Because Robert Taft, known as Mr. Republican, would not commit to supporting what I called mutual security, by which he meant NATO and the Marshall Plan. And Eisenhower had presided over the deaths of other people's children in the Second World War, and he was determined, he had a moral commitment to ensuring that there would not be a third world war.
Well, once I got us out of Korea and got rid of McCarthy, in the last 6 weeks of the last 6 years of the 1950s, those are a time perceived as a time of peace and prosperity. But then along came the 1960s and the country exploded with the civil rights movement, assassinations, the Vietnam War, and all the protests. So why were the 50s so calm and the 60s so explosive?
Well, I would unsurprisingly quarrel a little bit with the premise. So much of the 1950s set the stage for the more dramatic expression manifestation that happened in the 60s. The 50s were not placid and quiet if you were a Black American denied fundamental civil rights. They were not placid and calm if you were a school child being taught to get under your desk in the event of nuclear attack. They weren't placid and quiet if you were Dwight Eisenhower trying to stand up against a reflexive right wing that wanted to somehow take us back to 1896, or a hardcore left wing that thought more private resources should go into the public sphere so that central planners could spend money they thought better than you could. So the forces that were, as you put it, so explosive in the 1960s were in evidence and gathering force in the 1950s. What I think is so fascinating about Eisenhower is because he had fought a real war, he knew that small wars could become big wars. And his strong instinct was to, for instance, not go into Vietnam in 1954. He ended the Korean War. He was very careful about the Taiwan Straits, the moves of mainland China to try to threaten Taiwan. He really only deployed troops in a significant way twice. He once landed Marines in Lebanon to stop a kind of a pro-communist domino effect in the region. And he sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce the orders of a federal court when the governor of Arkansas chose to defy the Supreme Court. And so there was a kind of restraint that Eisenhower exercised, and presidents who exercised restraint. And Eisenhower did, Gerald Ford did, George Herbert Walker Bush did. Presidents who are more traditionally conservative in the sense of we just don't want to make things worse have a harder time in historical rankings because people like us like big wars and big legislation and big battles, and they're fun. And
as you know, Eisenhower's rankings started out low,
Yep.
the early 1960s, and over time, people came to have a deep appreciation for his whole approach. So,
well, just one thing that's important on this is part of the reason for that is Vietnam. I did not. We sent advisors, but he was, he did not was not a keen interventionist, which is quite relevant at this
Make him
hour.
look really smart.
Mm.
Let's talk about John F. Kennedy. He proved that if there's an American struggle issue that's considered political, and then the leader reclassifies it and declares it's a moral issue, then the likelihood of success in dealing with the issue goes way up. Exhibit A, civil rights. So is this issue of what's political versus what's moral at the heart of the American struggle?
That's very well put. I think it is. I think that, they're entwined, because politics, the root of politics is city. And what's the root of city? It is a collection of people. St. Augustine argued that the definition of a nation should be that it's a multitude of rational beings united by the common objects of their love. Three-pronged test, right? It's a multitude, so it's a collection of people. They are rational, so it suggests that they will not only fight for what they want, but they will negotiate and deal in a civilized way. And they must love something in common. And the American struggle, I believe, is the tension between our common love of the notion of innate human equality, the rule of law, and the ethos of fair play, and our more selfish appetites. And it shapes your life every day. It shapes my life every day. And therefore, it should not be surprising that it shapes the life of a country that is based on popular sovereignty.
Now, the final part of your book covers the time period from 1960 to today. So that's obviously a long time, 86 years. In other words, from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump. When we think about Nixon, the first word that comes to mind is Watergate, that arose from his, quote, titanic battle between hope and fear, as Brent Scowcroft described it to our friend Nixon biographer Evan Thomas. So how much long-term damage did Nixon's Watergate mess do to America's belief in itself as a nation of better angels' integrity that stood as the shining city on the hill?
I think in the fullness of time, I don't know that Watergate looms as large as we would have thought. And I haven't thought deeply about this, but it is a sign of the resilience of our institutions, I think, that, for instance, we could have within 27 months of Nixon's resignation in August of 1974, we could have a fair, closely fought election between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Carter won quite narrowly. It didn't occur to Ford to say it was a stolen election, to say it was fake. He obeyed the rule of law.
I think there are differences between
and
Gerald Ford and Donald Trump.
Yeah, more than one, not just the hair. But if you think about it, what Watergate gave us was, on the one hand, an enduring skepticism of what the government told us, but that's also true of Vietnam, right? The 5 o'clock follies, right? The sense
Pentagon
that,
Papers and all that
yeah,
stuff.
the government wasn't telling us the truth, which actually was more of a liberal thing. The liberals kind of came to this a little bit later than conservatives. Conservatives believed that the government couldn't be trusted, really beginning with Yalta, right? And some people thought Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy, right? If you want to track back, the John Birch Society, what Richard Hofstadter, who's also in the book, writes about in terms of a kind of conservative conspiracy theory. what Vietnam and Watergate did was it tended to bring the center and the center left and the left into the ranks of the distrustful, right? And so that said, a very resilient America had a Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama era where politics was, closely fought, very closely fought, particularly in 2000. But we accepted the results. We debated policy, and we got on with it. And then comes 16, which is, sort of where the book ends. I include President Trump's first inaugural address. I include Vice President Vance's acceptance speech to the convention in 2024, which I think is a very clear articulation of where a big part of the Republican Party is. And you had, I think, that part of that movement is at once has roots as far back as the McCarthy, George Wallace kind of illiberalism of the 50s and 60s, but is also something that we have to be quite honest about and recognize that the cares and concerns of the people who were so disaffected by the order, the ethos I just laid out, the Carter through Obama ethos, they were so disjointed, they were so disaffected with the world that order had produced that they were willing to administer what is now a prolonged shock to the system. And the thing about democracy is you can't love your country only when you win. And we have to recognize and try to address the concerns that led folks to, I think, kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. But their vote counts just as much as mine.
Well, let's talk briefly about Bush 41. You wrote a wonderful biography of him that I think has elevated his legacy. Certainly one of our best foreign policy presidents, although not exactly great success on the domestic front. But if you were with him right now, Jon, looked him in the eye, how would you complete this sentence? Mr. President, I wish you would have.
Great question. Mr. President, I wish you would have brought to the domestic sphere the energy and insight that you brought to the post-Cold War world. I wish that you had, in some ways, articulated an ethos that would have focused on education and healthcare, infrastructure, the means by which ordinary lives are elevated. There was an immense amount of good conservative center-right thought in that era. There were a lot of reform governors, in the 90s. The ideas were there. My friend Lamar Alexander, who was the Secretary of Education, I think argued to the president that he should have a domestic Desert Storm. And I think it would have removed, or at least minimized, I think, the calumny, the lie that somehow or another George Herbert Walker Bush didn't care about people. It's insane. He was one of the most sensitive, most empathetic men I ever knew. but he was, because of his innate conservatism, which was different than Reagan and his sons. Just as a parenthetical point, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush were conservative reformers. That's different than being a conservative, right? They wanted to shift policy in a way that helped produce conservative results. George H.W. Bush was a genuine 19th century conservative. He believed that most of what we would want to do would produce unknowable, unforeseeable, and undesirable results. He used to start conversations in the White House with, "How do we not make this worse?" Right? That's Edmund Burke coming back to life. The resurrection of Edmund Burke.
The answer is no. What's the question?
So that's where. So I wish he had. I wish he had shown us a little bit more of what that character, that remarkable character, that remarkable heart that he had. I wish he had let us inside a little bit more.
Now, you know his son, George W. Bush. I've heard that you may well write a biography of him like the one you did on his dad, which, from my perspective, as somebody who knows and likes George W. Bush a lot, I hope in fact happens. But to you, what's the most impressive thing about Bush 43 that caused you to consider writing his biography?
I think so. This is may sound odd, but when I was doing the book about his father, I came to spend more time with President Bush 43, particularly after he left office. And I found him to be a more complicated and interesting figure up close than I had thought of him from afar. And the other part of this, which I think as somebody in Dallas you will appreciate, is I defy anybody to spend 10 minutes with George Walker Bush and come away thinking he was not fully in charge of everything that happened. This idea that Dick Cheney was pulling strings, Dick Cheney pulled strings that George Bush didn't want him to pull, didn't want to pull himself. All right, that's what I should say, right? He had no, the idea that somehow he was a passive figure is just wrong. I believe he kept the country safe after September 11th. I believe that PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, is one of the vital humanitarian pieces of American policy. I believe that
Where do you come out on Iraq? I mean, to me, he followed the best intelligence that was available. He obviously didn't want a second attack after 9/11. So he made the decision based on that intelligence, which turned out to be wrong.
Yeah.
And then and of course, the decision he made at the time was endorsed by most Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and others. But then after the fact, people say, oh, well, he should have known, or he didn't have a plan. Where do you come out on his decision in the Iraq war?
I think, and I've shared this with him, I understand and appreciate that the intelligence leading into the war was thought to be correct. I don't believe that President Bush in any way misled the country into war. I don't think that's true. My thought about Iraq is that once we were in, self-evidently, the occupation, the rebuilding of the country did not go as we would hope. And I wish he had gotten to the surge a lot sooner. I think that the beginning of the war is understandable. There's a larger question, which is what did the president know, as Howard Baker would say, and when did he know it about the future of the country once we were in?
I mean, I'm sure you've read Peter Baker's book on the Bush presidency, and his decision to pursue the surge in his second term, to me, it was an unbelievable profile in courage. Since everybody was saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, he did it, and it turned out to be very successful.
Correct. The question for historians is, why did it take 3 years? And that's what that we have to be in the documents. We have to figure that out. But self-evidently, because he needed the surge, things were not going correctly. Things were not going well. So why did it take that long? And I just don't know the answer. There may be a perfectly good answer, but that's one of the open research questions that needs to be dealt with. But let me say too, I commend everybody. He saw the nativism coming. He saw the isolationism coming, and I think that and when the financial crisis came, he stepped in and violated his own philosophical beliefs. He used the power of the state to bail out the marketplace.
That I'm not going to be the president during the second Great Depression, no matter what.
Right.
Which was a profile in courage.
It was. And so, look, the point about the American presidency, I think, is we want it to be, people want these, so far, all men to be these superheroes, right? Or if you don't like them, you want them to be super arch villains. Well, guess what? They're somewhere in between. And that's where the value of history comes in.
For my final question, I'm going to close the interview with the subject of Donald Trump, who we've mentioned from time to time throughout. A president who many Americans struggle with because, on the one hand, they believe some of his policies are in fact good and some are not so good, which is true of most presidents' track records. But on the other hand, he is obviously, undoubtedly, unambiguously a narcissist, a bully, a man with little or no commitment to the Constitution, not much integrity, and a man consumed with revenge and retribution. And many Americans have said of him since 2016, I don't care about his character. What I care about are his policies. So what's your prediction on what Trump's legacy will be over the next half century?
It will depend. We're in the middle of the story. It will depend on how these policies, interventions, call them what you will, how they turn out. It is at this hour unclear. I do believe that a mark against him forever will be the introduction of what I think is a serious and I fear durable virus into the body politic, which is that if an election goes a way you don't like it, you just claim it's fake. You claim it was stolen. And that was simply not part of the broad political vernacular prior to President Trump in 2020. So that's going to be something that is the unfolding January 6th, I call it. That will be with him forever. We are currently engaged as we speak, in an incredibly complicated, incredibly fraught, incredibly dangerous military operation in the heart of the Middle East. And it may work out wonderfully, and it may not. And so what we are in the middle of the story. I will make one final point, because it's a plea in a way to the president. One of the things we know historically is that presidents often receive immense credit for things they do that challenge their base, that their base wasn't looking for. You mentioned President Nixon a moment ago. President Nixon going to China is one of the great examples of this. President Trump has never, if you'll stay within the metaphor with me, President Trump has not gone to China. He has not done anything that would have taken the immense, virtually unprecedented political capital he has with his base of supporters. He has not spent any of it. And I think if I were President Trump, that's a big if, I would take a look and think for a minute, should I spend some of this before it's gone? And one suggestion would be go pick up the immigration bill that the House failed to act on 12, 13 years ago and secure the border, but give people a path to citizenship. And I think President Trump could do virtually anything on that issue. And people would say, oh, well, the MAGA base won't let him. Well, the MAGA base was not thrilled with military interventions, but we've now intervened in Venezuela. We are now doing so in Iran, and they seem to be right there with him. So what do you want to do with all this? Do you just want to take it back to Mar-a-Lago, or do you want to spend some of it?
Yeah. Well, Jon, thanks so much for your time, and it's just been great. I love your book. I'm looking forward to your Eisenhower book next year. Keep up the good work, and hope our paths cross again soon.
Absolutely, Talmadge. Thanks so much. You're the best.
You bet.
Jon Meacham's new anthology, American Struggle, should be required reading in every high school history class in America. He gives a good account of over 400 years of American history in less than 500 pages. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and make sure you catch all my podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, the Washington Independent Review of Books website, and now the Dallas Morning News is publishing and promoting these podcasts. Until next time, remember the words of the late, great Bobby Bregan, you can't hit the ball with a bat on your shoulder. This is Talmadge Boston of Cross Examining History. Thanks for listening.